The United States of America has been the largest economy in the world since before the development of modern economic statistics during the Great Depression and World War II. But economists and historians have attempted to reconstruct GDP data for the past using what information is available, and they've generally concluded that aggregate income and output in the United States had already exceeded that of the British Empire by the start of World War I. At this point, the United States also exceeded England in terms of income per person and obviously far exceeded the larger British Empire, which at the time included deeply impoverished places like India and a large chunk of Africa. That enormous economic might allowed us to intervene decisively in both the First and Second World Wars, in both cases first through our power as a source of agricultural commodities and industrial products, and then secondarily as an actual fighting force of soldiers, sailors, and airmen. And of course, we won the war against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, in no small part thanks to the valor of our troops at war. But on another level, the Axis scarcely had a chance. Back in 1938, the gross domestic product of the United States alone was larger than that of Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. In practice, of course, the Axis also had to take on the large Soviet Union and the British Empire. But America alone had enough economic mass to take down its rivals. That manifested itself in the United States bringing superior materiel to bear on the battlefield, in American civilians enjoying higher wartime living standards than what was seen on foreign home fronts, and in America's ability to serve as the arsenal of democracy, supplying vast quantities of useful material resources to our allies through the Lend-Lease Act. But Germany was a wealthy, technologically advanced society, and Japan, though poorer, was not exactly an economic slouch. Germany's basic problem was that even after taking over Austria and the Sudetenland, it only had 80 million people. The United States had 130 million. The Soviet Union, by contrast, consistently maintained a population that was larger than America's. The United States was, however, much richer throughout the entire conflict, and consequently was able to mobilize much more national power. The basic closeness of the population dynamics, however, made Cold War competition something akin to a fair fight. If communism had been a good idea as an economic strategy, the Soviets could have caught us on per capita living standards and exceeded us in total national income and output. Instead, it was a bad idea, and they didn't. China and India, however, have a lot more people than we do, not a little bit more. And that means good economic policy alone won't be enough to keep us ahead. Because the point of this book is the proposition that we ought to take decisive steps to avert falling behind China, it's natural for readers to want me to predict exactly when China will overtake us under current policies. Once upon a time, I thought this would be an easy thing to look up with Google. But it turns out that if you try it, you get a range of different answers. In part, that's because as either Niels Bohr or Yogi Berra or both once quipped, predictions are hard, especially about the future. But in part, it's because the predictors are to an extent talking about different things. That's why one Bloomberg headline from 2018 argued that China had already become the world's biggest economy and urged Americans to get used to it, while one 3 months later argued that extrapolating when the world's second largest economy will overtake the first is a tricky business, riddled with caveats, and it would perhaps never happen. I don't particularly want to take a side in this international economic statistics nerd fight, but it's also a bad idea to just throw up our hands and say we have no way of knowing. How rich is China, really? One thing that makes comparisons hard is that each country measures its economy in its own currency. To do a comparison, you need to convert into a common currency using exchange rates. According to the International Monetary Fund, for example, in 2018, the per capita GDP in the United States was $62,870, while in Denmark it was $60,900. The United States, in other words, was about 3% richer. Market exchange rates, however, are very volatile. Over the course of July 2019, for example, the value of the British pound fell about 5% relative to the value of the US dollar, thanks to growing realization that Boris Johnson was going to become prime minister. That 5% decline had some real implications for the living standards of British people. It was really bad news for anyone who had already booked an August vacation to the United States. And it contains some serious information about investors' sense of the long-term implications of the situation in British politics. But obviously, the typical British person did not suddenly become 5% poorer in any meaningful sense over a single month that summer. Financial markets just bounce around much more rapidly than actual economic conditions change. For countries like China that don't allow their exchange rate to float up and down in the free market, the problem is different. You get a good deal of stability, but you also get changes that happen because of the shifting winds of government policy rather than economic conditions.